Hello, Serious Survivor here. And we know that gun control has been a big push with the current administration, and we've seen this before in the past. We're going to look at a couple of different things in this video. We're going to look at the red flag laws to begin with, and then we're going to look at the new document that was released by the Department of Justice, encouraging people to turn in their family members for thoughts, actions, or indicators of extremism. And it's really concerning, some of the things we're going to see here. The Justice Department encourages states to pass controversial red flag laws to curb gun violence. Well over a year ago, we've heard about the most controversial red flag laws designed to curb mass shootings, and there's a new action from the Department of Justice. Just this last week, the agency laid out a roadmap to help states craft their own versions of the law, which gives law enforcement and others another option to confiscate guns. Opponents argue these laws violate people's rights, but there's a renewed push to spread them across the country. Quote, a family member or police officer can go to the court and get a temporary restraining order against somebody who they feel is a dangerous to society and get their guns temporarily taken away, explained California Assemblymember Phil Ting, who proposed an expansion of California's red flag law that passed in 2019. We have way too many mass shootings across the country where people saw signs and didn't do anything. This puts the power back in their hands, end quote. According to Ting, California has confiscated more than 3,000 guns since they passed red flag legislation in 2016. Today, at least 19 states and D.C. have added red flag laws to their books, and these states are Washington, New York, Maryland, Florida, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Indiana, Massachusetts, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Just a few days back, the Department of Justice took new action to help states craft their own versions of these laws. It issued model legislation to help states write their own extreme risk protection orders that would let courts bar people in crisis from accessing guns with the goal of stopping a tragedy before it happens. The DOJ's new framework for red flag laws says states need to consult with a variety of stakeholders, from law enforcement to healthcare providers, as they consider crafting this new legislation. It also calls for police training on this type of legislation, including issues like implicit bias and crisis intervention. Those opposed to red flag laws say that we're concerned in part because in some cases a judge can just initially decide on the temporary order after hearing just one side of the story. The burden of proof needed to justify an order varies from state to state and on the type of order being sought. But in these cases, the person whose guns are being confiscated is surprised when the police show up at their door with an order. With the push for expansion of these laws nationwide, let's look at the document that was released by the Department of Justice. This document was originally written in 2019 and has been updated several times, and the most recent version is the one I'm going to be reading on from here. I'll leave a link to this document in the description below because it's very important to read through this. I'm not going to read the entire thing because it's too long for one video to read through everything, but I do want to point out the wording in a lot of the different situations or a lot of different areas in it. Now, as we scroll down, the table of contents and introduction, then it talks about Group A, B, and C. And basically Group A is what's a group or a list of what they call indicators that basically tell other people that this particular person is a danger to society or is a violent extremist, as the word is defined by them. Group B, the indicators are moderately diagnostic, which means the indicators on their own may not indicate something, but if a person falls into one or more indicators, then they could possibly be classified as a domestic extremist at this point. And then Group C, these are the less identifying characteristics basically, and it requires several of the indicators in this section to have someone reported, for violent extremism. So we're going to brush over a few of these. Now, as we look here, it talks about what's called diagnosticity. And what that means is to the extent to which behavior demonstrates mobilization to violence. And that's just basically a big word that they decided to make up and put on this that is just a level indicator basically. So that's the diagnosticity. Category of behavior, the types of categories: preparation, developing and displaying a readiness to commit a violent act. And as we read through this, you're going to see the words violent act and all, and you're going to see that in some of it, but in others you're not. That's where it's really quite disturbing. Motivation and then concealment, and that's another concerning area. So we're going to scroll down a little bit. Like I said, this is a document you probably want to read. It's not that long to read it. Now, Group A is pretty straightforward, Pretty straightforward. It's talking about people that are actually, literally, showing signs of violent behavior, threatening to do it, attempting to join terrorist organizations and things like that. So it's pretty straightforward. There's some concerning things in there, but not really as concerning as some of the other ones. As you can see here, the parts of now we're in Group B. Let's go back to Group 7 there. All right, now we're in Group B, and it talks about obtaining explosives, simulating an attack or basically a dry run on an attack or a target, surveilling potential targets, inquiring about jobs that provide sensitive access in a suspicious manner. Legal documents tend to lay out the definitions for a lot of the words, and a lot of the words have specific definitions, but the word suspicious is one of those that the definition is not laid out for. Suspicious to me may not be suspicious to you, and vice versa. And that's one of the most concerning things about a lot of what we're reading in this particular document. Look at the examples: conducting research for target or target selection, and some of the things it talks about are acquiring maps, blueprints, schematics, technical capabilities, planning, and logistics. Now, a lot of people will look and they will say, well, they mean maps of the thing that's going to be attacked, but this can be interpreted a lot of different ways, and that's what we have to realize, is that this is being left open for interpretation to the law enforcement agency that's going to enforce this. There is way too much that's left open for them to say, well, this falls into the category of suspicious behavior. Once again, suspicious sending of financial resources or survivalist gear to people or groups overseas. Now, I understand the overseas part and money overseas. Accepting and, right? Creating or joining a group that promotes violence to address perceived social, political, and ideological grievances. Now, as we've seen over this last year, that the people during January 6th are definitely, were grouped into this type of category. And a lot of these categories, not because they so much did anything that wasn't already being done the year before, but it was the fact that these terms are malleable. These terms can be applied as they want to apply these terms to certain individuals. So they could look at one situation and say, oh, this is of no consequence to us, and then look at a second situation and say that, this is definitely proof the person's a violent extremist. It's too open. It's too open to trust. Having a membership. And it talks about violent extremism a lot, and I don't think anybody wants violent extremism, so we're all on board with that. Advocating violence. Here's a couple that do bother me: employing new or increased use of concealment behavior, counter surveillance techniques, encrypted media apps, software platforms, disposable burner phones. Well, how many of us use a VPN, an encrypted VPN at that? I know I do. And I use a lot of things. I have a lot of devices that can block someone from reading the RF cards or the NFC cards on my credit cards, the near field communications. I have a lot of devices like that. And even though I may have no ill intent for that, then I could still easily fall into this category, and anyone can if you're using encryption on your media apps, software platforms. If you have an extra phone, a burner phone. I have a spare cell phone that's not registered that I could use, if I needed to. I just have to activate it. Would that be considered a burner phone? Would I be a violent extremist at that point? And the question is, it's left open to those who are making the arrest or performing the investigation. Deleting or manipulating social media or other online accounts to misrepresent location or hide group membership, contacts, or activities in support of violent extremism. Well, we saw that the 3%ers were just branded as a terrorist group by the Canadian government. So that basically means anyone who would be reading about, who would be looking at the webpage for the 3%ers or doing research on them, you could possibly fall into this category yourself. Suspicious building and testing of explosives, all right. Suspicious or illegal acquisition of weapons or ammunition. acquisition of weapons or ammunition. And it doesn't say just illegal means, it says suspicious. Well, some people might think it's suspicious that you have 2 pistols or 3 AR-15s or an AR and a shotgun and a pistol. Some people may consider that suspicious, and you would be turned in at that point. Unusual purchase of military-style tactical equipment, personal protective equipment, body armor. Now, what is an unusual purchase of military-style tactical equipment? Would that be if I bought an entire outfit, if I bought the body armor, all the gear I needed, or is it just the body armor? By buying body armor, do I fall into this category? By buying a military backpack, do I fall into this category? By having a military helmet, having Kevlar vest, having anything like that, then we could very well fall into this category because these terms are not defined. Unusual. Suspicious, unexplained, or unusual physical or weapons training. And it does say multiple non-recreational gun range visits as an example. Now, that in itself is just as confusing. Multiple non-recreational gun range visits, or a gun range visit's recreational. There's not much way it couldn't be. So this is something, if you go to the gun range, and I guess if you're being serious and you're trying to improve your aim and trying to better your grouping, then this would be considered non-recreational because you're not having fun, I guess. I don't know. And that's the problem with this type of thing. Financial transactions, disposing of assets, and some of it makes sense. If somebody starts telling you, hey, goodbye, if something happens to me, you sort of start thinking that something's going to happen. So a lot of this is pretty straightforward, but I'm not going to read off all of it because it's fairly long, but I do want to go down to the bottom and read off the last 4 things right here. It is important to consider the totality of circumstances when observing potential indicators, as some factors may increase the risk of extremist violence in a given situation. These factors may include, but are not limited to, inability to cope with the changes or perceived failures in relationships, school, or career. Think about that statement. Those who decided they didn't want to wear face coverings, those who decided they didn't want to believe a certain way, we're deemed as those who can't cope. We're deemed with those that can't accept. So that immediately puts anyone who doesn't agree with the agenda that we've seen this past year, puts you in that category. A history of violence, social isolation or inability to join with or relate to others. Now, some people just don't like being around other people. Now, I know that a lot of times they'll say that this is an indicator, something's going on, someone who just stays to themselves. But that's not always true. I know a lot of people that stay to themselves, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. The last one, possession of, access to, or being familiar with weapons or explosives. I have possession of firearms. I have access to firearms. I'm familiar with my firearms. Now, I don't have any explosives, but I do have firearms. Who owns a firearm has met this criteria at this point. Now, the document does talk about confiscation of guns, and it does talk about those who fall into these categories. Not only would their firearms be confiscated, but they could be facing some serious prison time. I encourage you to read this document and do a little more research on it yourself, too, because this is very extensive. This is just the highlights, and or lowlights, if you will. And I hope the information helps. This is very concerning, and it should be for all of us because the push is on. It's here. It's right now. It's in front of us. Thanks a lot for watching. God bless. For now, Serious Survivor, out.